Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiriduluale, the headlines. Referring to the Cold War, current chairman of the UN Security Council and Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, says the world is at a dangerous threshold. EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell says it's good China distanced itself from its ambassador's comments about the former Soviet republics. And world military spending reaches an all-time high of $2.24 trillion in 2023. We begin from New York in the United States, where Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has told the United Nations Security Council that the world had reached a more perilous situation even than that seen during the Cold War. Mr. Lavrov was chairing a meeting on multilateralism and the founding UN Charter as Russia holds the monthly rotating presidency of the 15-member body for April.
The situation has been worsened by the loss in faith in multilateralism as the financial and economic aggression of the West is destroying the benefits of globalization. When the United States and its allies are abandoning diplomacy and demanding relations be clarified on the battlefield, this is all done in the halls of the United Nations, which was created to prevent the horrors of war.
Meanwhile, the United States envoy to the United Nations has made a direct appeal to Foreign Minister Lavrov, urging him to release 2 U.S. citizens currently detained in Russia. During that Security Council meeting chaired by Mr. Lavrov, Linda Thomas-Greenfield pushed Russia to free former United States Marine Paul Whelan and Wall Street Journal reporter Ivan Geskovich. The ambassador, who was speaking at the UN headquarters, in her words said, "I am calling on you right now to release Paul Whelan and Ivan Geskovich immediately, and to let Paul and Ivan come home and to cease this barbaric practice once and for all." She added that the men were being used as political bargaining chips and human pawns. For EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, it is good news that China had distanced itself from comments made by its ambassador to France that called into question the sovereignty of Ukraine and other former Soviet republics. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said earlier that it respects the status of former Soviet member states as sovereign nations, distancing itself from comments by its envoy to Paris that triggered an uproar amongst European capitals. Several European Union foreign ministers had said comments by Ambassador Liu Xiaoye were unacceptable and had asked Beijing to clarify its stance.
It's also important, and I want to signal that Beijing has distanced itself from the unacceptable remark of its ambassador to Paris. I issued a tweet yesterday saying that I hope that this statement or remarks by the ambassador was not or were not the position, the official position of China, and now we have a concrete answer that it's not.
EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy has thanked Estonia for its defense support and willingness to facilitate relevant communication with other parties. The Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, whose country is a member of NATO as well as the European Union, had talks with Mr. Zelenskiy in the northwestern city of Zhytomyr and signed a joint declaration with him condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, Estonia, which is a member of NATO and the European Union, supported Kiev's calls for accession to NATO. It comes as NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said after talks in Kiev last week that Ukraine's rightful place was in the military alliance, but did not say when it might be able to join. Russia has said weapons supplies to Ukraine by NATO countries are dragging out the conflict and raising the possibility of a further escalation. It regards Ukrainian accession to NATO as a threat to its own security. And Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner Group, says Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy would start a counter-offensive if and when Bakhmut falls. Mr. Prigozhin said on a Telegram post, which reads, "As soon as we finish taking Bakhmut, as soon as we drive out the last soldier from him or destroy him on the territory of Bakhmut, the Ukrainian counter-offensive will begin on that day. The Ukrainians will put up a huge number of troops." The post added that as soon as Bakhmut is taken, Zelensky will need the greatest victory. And for this, he will launch that very counter-offensive. Why hasn't it started yet? First, because it rains, and absolutely everything gets stuck in the fields. You can only use roads. Even pickup trucks will get stuck, not to mention tanks. The second factor is May the 9th. May 9th, or Victory Day, celebrates the Soviet Union's role in defeating Nazi Germany. And Lithuania's Energy Minister Denis Kreivys says the country will make a decision on whether to withdraw from a treaty governing the common power grid of Russia, Belarus, and the three Baltic states by August the 6th, based on a review of studies into the potential effect. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all members of NATO and the European Union, remain a part of the Soviet-era Brel circuit, with Russia and Belarus relying on Russian operators to control frequencies and balance the grid. The three countries signed a deal in 2018 to decouple from the Brel circuit and join the continental power grid by 2025, but Lithuania wants to leave in the first part of 2024. Neither Latvia nor Estonia has yet agreed to an earlier decoupling. Australia has said the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines, long-range strike capabilities, and its northern bases will be among the country's 6 priority areas after a major review of its defense strategy found the armed forces were not, quote, fully fit for purpose. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese initiated the defense strategy review shortly after he was elected in May of last year. A redacted version of the classified defense strategic review led by former Australian Defence Forces Chief Angus Houston and former Defence Minister Stephen Smith, and the government's response was released publicly yesterday. The defence overhaul comes amidst rising tension in East Asia, particularly over the self-ruled island of Taiwan, and as China forges ahead with the modernization of its own military. And world military spending has reached an all-time high of $2.24 trillion in 2022, as Russia's invasion of Ukraine has fueled a sharp jump in military spending across Europe. That's according to a leading defense think tank. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, said in its annual report on global military expenditure that global spending rose for the 8th consecutive year. There was a 13% rise in Europe, the steepest in at least 30 years. SIPRI said most of that was linked to Russia and Ukraine, but other countries also stepped up military spending in response to perceived Russian threats. Let's talk to a regular contributor, security expert, Chidi Warner, who joins us from the British capital, London. Good morning to you, Chidi. Thank you for your time, as always.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the defense spending, shall we? For those who have been following fairly closely, like yourself, this is no surprise. I mean, there have been massive investments in the last 12 months or so by various countries, even those not directly connected with the conflict. That's not mentioned in places like the United States, Ukraine, Russia, and so on. But if we just take countries like Australia, for example, and that AUKUS deal that it entered to with Britain and the United States, I mean, the estimates vary, but from what we understand, over the next 5 years or thereabouts, on the submarines and some of the long-range capabilities, they're expecting to spend something like $450 billion. So, I mean, that's a huge chunk of $2.24 trillion, I mean, if you look at it from that perspective. Britain is also raising its spending, the EU is, Germany is, and then, of course, the combatants are. So this figure is quite viable, right?
Yeah, it's a very large figure, but I think one needs to be a little bit careful in terms of looking at the figure as a by itself in isolation, and the devil is very much in the detail. It's not just that people are spending these eye-watering amounts of money. It's what are they spending it on, and that I think is where the fascinating element of it. So it's very clear that the war in Ukraine has caused countries to spend a lot more money on their armed forces. But when we drill down into it, every country perceives its threats differently, and the war in Ukraine has maybe made people spend more money on their direct defense, on the defense of Ukraine, but also about looking at their own threats or their threats, the threat profile of their adversaries, and realize that maybe they need to do the things differently. So if we take Australia, Australia's defense spending is not aimed at, it's not as a result of the war in Russia directly or war in Ukraine directly. It's more towards defending its interest in the Pacific Ocean and in the around the South China Sea. So getting nuclear submarines is not to counter Russia; it's to counter China, who, strangely enough, is Australia's biggest trading partner. So there was a weird relationship going on there. The United Kingdom was, consistently boasts of spending the most money or exceeding the NATO 2%, guideline. But most of that money has been spent on aircraft carriers, one of which doesn't work. And that has absolutely nothing to do with the biggest threat currently facing the UK, which is a war in Europe, a land war in Europe. These aircraft carriers are essentially useless. They can't operate, to support any sort of ground operations in Europe. Maybe at best in the Mediterranean, but they would always be vulnerable to, missiles coming or anti-ship missiles. The same with looking at countries like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. Why has their defense spending gone up? That's mainly because of the supports that they're giving to Ukraine. So they're spending a huge amount of money providing equipment to Ukraine, but also replenishing their stocks. So that, again, is a direct correlation. But it's not so much that countries have suddenly decided we're going to just spend a lot of money. Everybody has essentially had a wake-up call and decided to, we're going to spend money. And I think the final and more interesting point about this is most of this spending, as I said, is not just, in NATO countries. It's also happening in Asia. Again, people looking at what happened in Russia and Ukraine and realizing that, the prospect of war is not as far away as we think. And sorry, there is one final point, a final point, which is another fascinating point for me is, the big narrative for Russia leading up to this war was NATO is, preparing to attack us. NATO is, preparing for war. But as we can see, the cupboard is actually bare. Most NATO countries can barely muster, credible forces to defend themselves, much less to conduct a kind of offensive operations against a power as big and as powerful as Russia. So it's kind of it's ironic in that Russia has actually created a situation that it claims it was trying to prevent. It has caused European countries, which are quite happy to, let their militaries degrade. It has caused them to take their military seriously and start rearming. I mean, Poland is a crazy example. It's building a huge army with Korean and locally made weapons and American weapons. That is a definite credible threat to Russia. This would not have happened if Russia hadn't been, creating the military threat to Europe that it has been.
Now, one other part of this that, of course, is extremely fascinating, and I know that you probably had seen that in that spending, is that a great deal, probably, of this figure, even as one remains very careful, as you indicated, about taking it in isolation, a great deal of this figure is being spent by China. China is building fortifications, fortresses, fighter jets, submarines, aircraft carriers at a dizzying pace. Already, I mean, a country that has possibly the largest army, if all things are considered, and then now the largest navy, and is building aircraft carriers and all of that. A lot of this spending is also coming from China, and that in itself is something to look at pretty closely, because a lot of what you described in the Asia Pacific is as a result of Chinese activity.
Yes, and the Chinese dynamic is interesting. So Britain's building aircraft carriers not so much to fight in the North Atlantic, which is its main stamping ground, and which arguably was where the Royal Navy should be concentrated on. And it's not aiming, to fight in the Mediterranean. It's aiming to fight in the Asia Pacific theater in the Pacific Ocean. The same as we've mentioned with Australia, but China is in a very unique position in that whilst it's now projecting power and, you know, has multiple disputes with multiple countries, be it the Philippines, Vietnam, Australia, obviously Taiwan being the big one, it can't be everywhere at once. It can't, you know, it can't replicate what the Americans have done over the centuries of putting bases everywhere. And more importantly, the Chinese military has no combat experience. So it's great building all this shiny equipment, which is, you know, really useful. But if you've never used it before, if you've never been in combat before, it's not about, you know, courage. It's just about experience of understanding how your systems actually work under pressure. You know, as we've discussed earlier, the Russian concept of the battalion tactical group is great on paper, but in reality, it falls apart. And you will never know that. You know, all the simulations that have been run have always shown that, you know, a Russian unit would, you know, handily defeat, you know, a peer, you know, a US or American unit, simply because of all the enablers that are built into that unit. But in reality, that falls apart because of manpower, because of training, because of experience, and because of the way these units are being used. The Chinese have no way of knowing how well their military will perform. But at the same time, they're faced with a series of adversaries. So they've got a problem with the Indians on their border up in the Himalayas. They've got a problem, as I've mentioned, with, you know, the Western powers, be it the Americans. They've got the Taiwanese. They've got issues with the Philippines, with the Vietnamese. And whilst, you know, there is a great fear of China, the problem is that all of these things can happen all at once. If China decides to go to war with Taiwan, that could be a great opportunity for the Philippines to take back some of the islands that they're contesting with China, or the Vietnamese to push their advantage, or the Indians to push their advantage. So China has to be able to prepare for and counter all these threats simultaneously, at the same time project enough power to keep people from challenging China, and also to have enough power, if they choose to have a credible military option of taking Taiwan. All of this is what is leading this massive defense spending. But as I said, it's all predicated on, I believe, on a belief that by building as big as possible, you know, it will stop, you know, the inevitable from happening. I do not think, and I could be very wrong, it could happen tomorrow, but I don't think China necessarily wants to use this massive military. It's more that this military gives it a very, very cogent negotiating piece.
I must ask you before we leave the topic about Africa in all of this, because one of the things that those I spoke to when I read this paper about this new defense spending record asked is how much of it can we attribute to African countries? I mean African countries also have disputes, internal and external as well, and some of the bases that were mentioned, for example, in Djibouti and a couple of other places, are on the African continent. So, I mean, one wants to ask, how much of this can we attribute to Africa, especially given that the kind of equipment you're talking about, shiny, new, the other thing is that it's also quite costly.
Yeah, so as a proportion of the global spend, you know, Africa's spend is quite small. But, you know, considering, you know, the economies of the countries we're talking about, you know, there's a lot being spent on weapons in Africa. You know, Ethiopia just fought a ridiculous, you know, war with itself, and there's been a huge expenditure on weapons there. Sudan is going down the same route, fighting a war with itself. But you know, when we look at across the Sahel, from Mali to Senegal to Nigeria, you know, there's been huge amounts of money spent on weapons from a variety of sources. Most of them coming from, you know, the East, China, you know, the Gulf states, Russia, Belarus. Well, not so much Russia anymore. And before it was Belarus, Ukraine, Russia. And then other countries, again, let's use Nigeria as an example, have been purchasing a huge amount of equipment to re-equip their armed forces. The air forces had taken delivery of a lot of platforms. This is a huge spend, especially for a country like Nigeria with our economic problems. And again, you know, what I want to emphasize is that whilst every other country, or wrong, every other continent, their defense spending is based on countering external threats. In Africa, almost all of this spending is based on countering internal threats. And then, you know, finally, when you're looking at except the big exception is North Africa, where they're all building up huge, sophisticated and complicated militaries to challenge each other. So Algeria's, you know, up against, you know, has a rival in Morocco, as well as, you know, the Western Sahara situation. You've got the Libyan civil war, that implosion, and then Egypt, you know, builds a huge army, not only to defend itself as it claims, but also to project power down into down towards Sudan and down into across to the Israelis. So the Africa spend, is to summarize, is not as big as obviously the rest of the world. But what's interesting about the spend is that it's increasing, especially in relation to our economies. But it's also almost all directed at internal threats.
I must ask you, I'm moving away now from military spending to the actual conflict in question here now, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The Wagner Group boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, is saying that Ukraine will launch the much-awaited counter-offensive the day Bakhmut falls. I assume, of course, he's referring to the day Bakhmut falls to the Russians. That would, in essence, open up the road, as we are told, to other parts of Ukraine for Russia, which is why the battle in that city is so ferocious. You and I have spoken about this in the past. The Ukrainians are not letting go. The Russians are pouring in masses of troops and equipment there. And on the face of it, for very little strategic value. That was until Vladimir Zelensky admitted that if Bakhmut falls to the Russians, then, Ukraine's military position might become slightly more untenable. And now the Wagner boss is saying, look, the counteroffensive will be launched the day Bakhmut falls to the Russians. Does this make any sense to you militarily or strategically?
Yes, I mean, it makes sense, but it's beyond the words that are being used. What's happening here is, shaping operations. Everyone knows this offensive is coming. Now, the big problem is, everybody knows the offensive is coming. What nobody knows is where is it going to fall? When is it going to start? The Russians don't know. The Ukrainians clearly have an idea in their head of when they're going to launch it. And I believe that it's not going to be on a certain date. It's going to be conditions based, and I doubt that condition will be the fall of Bakhmut, because Bakhmut has an operational purpose in that their logistics runs through or around Bakhmut. So if Bakhmut falls, it would affect their supply lines into what they hold of Donbass. But more importantly, for them, Bakhmut is sucking up a huge amount of Russian resource, a lot of Russian time, a lot of Russian artillery, to be honest, which is key in this battle. So holding that all of that Russian effort there in Bakhmut is key. So there is logic to what Prigozhin says, is that once Bakhmut falls, theoretically that frees up a lot of Russian resource to go to other theaters and stiffen up the line. But the reality is that if it falls, it kind of doesn't affect what the Ukrainians will do much. The key thing, as he actually also mentioned, is the weather. Right now it's spring in Europe. It's rainy. The fields are quite muddy. The snow in the mountains are melting, so the rivers are quite full. So that means that crossing rivers is going to be much more difficult. It's much more muddy. They're much deeper. So what the Ukrainians are most likely waiting for is a little bit more dry weather, so you can go off road. The rivers will come down a little bit, so they're easier to cross, or there's more crossing points. And also to have degraded the Russians to a certain point where they can launch an offensive. So you'll see that all of this, take a lot of what's being said, the words with a pinch of salt. Is everybody is simply just throwing out words to kind of push the other person to kind of react. The Ukrainians will claim that Bakhmut is, the linchpin of their defense, because they want the Russians to focus on Bakhmut. The Russians will claim that without Bakhmut, that Bakhmut is a pointless, battle for the Ukrainians, because they want the Ukrainians to stop the battle so they can free up their forces. Again, everybody understands it's all theater. What we should be looking at is, to be brutally honest, is the things that are not being said and the areas that nobody's talking about, because that's where things are happening.
Well, the reports are also indicating that troops are beginning to mass on the on one side, on the bank of the Dnieper River. The Ukrainian troops are beginning to mass there. And the Russians are also beginning to dig up trenches and mass on the other side of the river. And what's keeping each side from attempting to cross to engage the other is what you've just described, the weather. So this is, as you've just pointed out, a question of time. But could it also be that both sides are waiting for reinforcements, both in terms of troops and particularly equipment, on the side of the Ukrainians, because much of the tanks, the fighting vehicles, and in some instances the planes that were promised by some of their friends have yet to arrive.
Yeah, so there is no commander that will go into a battle thinking I've got everything I want right now. So I'm sure the Ukrainians want more, and this is why every single time you hear a Ukrainian official speak, he's talking as if Ukraine is about to fall tomorrow. But what I would suggest is that everything that's needed for this offensive is most likely already in Ukraine. Everything that's being amassed now is either to follow up on that offensive or to keep building up an additional reserve. I would think the biggest thing that we're waiting for is, as I said, the biggest condition is going to be the weather and, how much the Ukrainians can degrade the Russians, how much they can deceive them. So the crossing of the Dnieper is very interesting. It is, as I said, the key thing we should always look at is the things that are not being spoken about. The Russians have spoken about this. The Ukrainians have spoken about this. There's other things happening that nobody's talking about. So that's, again, quite interesting. The fact that this is being made a big deal of is, again, indicating to me that this is part of the shaping operations, but it might not be the main effort, mainly because where they've reported to have crossed is going to be difficult for the Ukrainians to advance with heavy weapons. It's quite swampy, not very good roads, and it's difficult to supply, across they're still within artillery range of the Russians, and the whole of Kherson is in artillery range of the Russians. So it'll be difficult to supply, and it's difficult to do a rapid advance from there. But by simply crossing the river and establishing a presence, the Russians have to react. They have to do something. They have to try and destroy that beachhead. So again, they've got to deploy forces. They've got to deploy resources there, and that again creates a dilemma for the Russians. So one of the key things, that can aid an offensive is not necessarily creating a problem. So if I have a tank here, that's a problem, and I can think, but then I can think of a solution, which is, I need an anti-tank weapon, or I need a mine, or another tank. But if I create a dilemma, as in I've got two tanks and I've only got one RPG, then I've got to decide which tank I've got to destroy. So that's exactly what the Ukrainians are doing. They're creating multiple dilemmas for the Russians by this crossing here, by, the fighting back moves. You'll hear that there's been attacks in Crimea, in Sevastopol, there's been attacks, into Belgorod. It's creating that dilemma for the Russians as to where do we move our troops, where do we move our reserves, how are we going to be, where is this offensive going to be launched from? So I think we're not there yet. I think we've got a few good weeks until the weather improves. We've got some good dry weather, and when the Russians have there'll be more of these deception ops. But we are definitely in close to the end of the shaping preparation phase of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and that decisive phase when they actually launch their attack is coming soon.
And indeed, we will keep a very close eye on it, and we will have you, of course, with us as we keep that close eye on it to make sense of what is happening. Chidi Nwanu, as always, many thanks for your perspective on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome back. The Russian state-owned news agency TASS says a letter containing an unknown substance has been sent to the French embassy in Moscow, citing law enforcement. TASS quoted a source as saying employees of the French embassy received a letter with an unknown substance inside it yesterday evening. Law enforcers are currently working at the scene. However, the French Foreign Ministry had no immediate comment on the report. And members of the Council of Europe, the continent's leading human rights watchdog, have expressed solidarity with jailed Russian opposition activist Vladimir Kara-Murza in Strasbourg. Outspoken Kremlin critic, Mr. Kara-Murza was jailed for 25 years by a Moscow court on April the 17th in the harshest sentence of its kind since Russia sent its troops into Ukraine last year, after it found him guilty of treason and other offenses which he denied. Mr. Kara-Murza's wife, Evgenia, was present in the show of solidarity, saying, "Words are my only weapon." Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is 41 and a father of 3 and an opposition politician who holds Russian and British passports, spent years speaking out against President Vladimir Putin and lobbied Western governments to impose sanctions on Russia and individual Russians for purported human rights violations.
Here, I have often been lost for words to describe the heartbreak, the sadness, the fury at seeing so many innocent lives lost in this terrible war that the Russian state is leading against Ukraine. at Ukrainian cities being annihilated, at families being torn apart. I'm often lost for words, and yet words are my only weapon, my only means to make the world see, to make sure no one turns away or decides that it's time to go to business as usual and start looking for compromises yet again in dealing with a bully and a murderer. When asking for a 25-year prison sentence for my husband, prosecutor Loktionov made a very revealing statement. Talking about Vladimir, he said, "This is our enemy who must be punished." In a sense, he told the truth. Vladimir indeed rejects everything this government stands for. The things dictatorships of the world are most afraid of are the truth and that inner freedom that makes people stand up to the worst monsters, that refusal to be intimidated, to be scared into silence. As Vladimir would say, the night is the darkest before the dawn. We will prevail, and Russia will be free, because we are Russians too, and we refuse to be scared.
Yevgenia Karamurza, wife of the jailed Russian opposition politician. Let's talk now to our expert on international relations theory, Dr. Tapo Thomas, who speaks to us online from the Lagos State University in the nation's commercial capital. Good morning to you, Doc. Thank you for your time. Welcome to the program. Can you hear me, Professor Thomas? Are you with us?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right.
However, it's breaking a bit.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us at this point.
I can hear you clearly.
Yes. Let me begin by asking you about the issues of diplomacy and international relations that have ensued with this conflict in Ukraine. There are citizens of America in particular that have been detained in Russia, and at the United Nations, the Americans led a couple of other countries to demand their freedom. But, I mean, in reality, if you're detained in that country, it is something for the judiciary, isn't it?
Sure.
Now, if that is the case, why make a show out of it at the United Nations?
Well, definitely it's going to be the problem of the judiciary. But we are talking of two different countries. I mean, two countries with different judicial systems. One one dictates what happens or what judgments to give based on certain issues, environmental, political, and diplomatic. So whatever is dictated to the judge is what he is going to pronounce as the judgment. I'm talking about Russia specifically. I do not think that the Americans feel comfortable with a judicial system that is being directed or manipulated by the autocratic leadership of Russia, and they know that is a way to suppress, to also attack and to come for the arresting and trying and putting on trial those they believe would definitely have some kind of strategic connection with the Americans, and that's why you can see Paul Whelan, who happened to be a former agent, and then you can see a journalist. So they know those who are very important to the who have a strategic importance to the Americans, and definitely is a political thing and a very kind of sensitive thing, very strategic thing. The Americans are fighting from all fronts, and no one can actually show what retaliatory measures or actions the US is going to take against them. But judicial system in Russia, definitely you can see that almost all the five, including those who are even Russians, but who are dissenting, who have a dissenting voice against the war in Ukraine, They have always, none has been freed so far. None has been freed, and no appeal has been won. You know, this is not something that will happen in the United States based on the liberal tendency of, the liberal system of their judiciary. So I want to believe that it's not something that the judiciary is going to settle. It's something that will have to be debated, or something that will have to be handled politically or diplomatically. So how it's going to end, nobody can predict. Whether it's going to come through war, or whether it's going to continue like this with this Georgia thing here, at whatever level the Americans are ready for the situation. But I don't know nobody can preempt what they will do next if Russia refuses to release Paul Whelan and Evan.
Now, do you see a sense of deja vu in all of this? That because some of these parties have contributed at different times. I'm talking about the Russians, the Americans, and other members of the Security Council, the French, the Chinese, and so on, have contributed to weakening the powers of the United Nations to help or to oversee the resolution of conflicts like this. If we talk about the detention of people in other countries, by other countries for what are deemed political reasons, and what you just explained now about the differences in the judicial systems of those countries. Do you see a sense of deja vu about it from the viewpoint that if these countries had not played a role in weakening the United Nations in the past, perhaps now the United Nations would have a stronger voice in being the kind of forum where this kind of issues could have been resolved? I don't know if you heard me, Professor Thomas.
Well, I didn't hear clearly, but I can come up with an idea. You are trying to ask me what if these two powers, the United States and Russia, and the United States and Russia haven't played some mediatory roles in some of these, in some of the issues that are similar in proportion or in nature or character to what is happening between them now. Well, these are what I will call what is emanating, or what is coming up from this, is the fact that there are inherent contradictions in the instrument setting up the United Nations. And I want to see, and I want to believe that, even as at now, the Ukrainians have no option than to go along with the United States, but they still feel that the United States can still do something different, something they can still take some action to prevent a situation where Russia is going to chair the United Nations Security Council for 1 month, because they know the implications. They know what Russia can do in the 1 month that is going to be there. And in any case, it has even manifested from the first day, when they had the meeting. And we are looking at so many scenarios coming up at the same time. And the Russians are not showing any sign of even accepting, and they want to continue to reinforce. They want to continue to reinforce their position at the international level by having the opportunity to also bring across their own positions on some of the issues. And you could see that Lavrov has started by lambasting the United States for whatever it's doing. So it's an opportunity for them to also have a say in what is happening, and then to also promote their own positions. So how this is going to be resolved, like I said, one cannot predict, one cannot be able to preempt. But the position is this. This is a situation where what is happening is so irritating. Irritating in the sense that if you have a nation that has invaded another country and is encroaching on the sovereignty and independence of the nation, haven't even signed an agreement called the Budapest Memorandum, 1994, December 5, haven't signed an agreement that they were going to respect the delineations between Russia and Ukraine as it was in 1994, as it was. And don't forget, Crimea was taken over again by Russia in 2014. So which means the Russians have started to desecrate the agreement, the Budapest Agreement of 1994, as far back as 2014. So when you have a nation like this, when you have a nation like Russia chairing the council, it creates a kind of moral question or a moral problem for the institution itself. And in any case, what do you call the United Nations? Is it just a body being controlled by these 5 people, especially Russia, China, and especially Russia and US? You understand? So everybody has come to present his own position in the body. So I do not foresee a situation where this will be resolved amicably, because the two of them are flexing muscles, and where it's going to end is going to be very tough. And that's why Lavrov has expressed the fear that this thing is very dangerous, because he can see that the ominous signs there that is going to be a very tough battle ahead.
Indeed. Professor Dapo Thomas, thank you so much for your time on the program this morning. As always, interesting perspective, deep sense of history. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Leaders from European countries surrounding the North Sea have pledged to rapidly scale up offshore wind power generation in the region to strengthen energy security at a summit in Austin, Belgium. Leaders from 7 European countries, including France, Germany, and the Netherlands, alongside non-EU countries Norway and Britain, pledged to speed up the build-out of wind farms, develop energy islands or connected renewable generation sites at sea, and work on carbon capture and renewable hydrogen projects in the region. The aim is also to curb reliance on Russian gas and reduce use of CO2-emitting fossil fuels, which remain dominant. Norway last year became Europe's biggest gas supplier after Russia cut deliveries to Europe following its invasion of Ukraine.
Move out. A milestone to make of the North Sea the biggest green power plant in the world. We aim for a capacity of 130 gigawatts by 2030, 300 gigawatts by 2050. By then, we will be able to provide electricity for 300 million households on the European continent. But the real force we have is our private sector. And I'm extremely happy at this summit to have more than 120 of our finest companies who are present here, who will be working together between them, but also often in a public-private partnership, to making sure that we can realize the things that we announce. Very often when we announce things, it's very good. When you realize them, this is where we really make the effort. So
the European Commission will help to deliver on these targets. And this is why we have the Green Deal Industrial Plan. All our proposals to implement this industrial plan are on the table now. First, the Net Zero Industry Act that will help to create a conducive environment for clean tech industry. It will support innovation and, very important, the manufacturing at scale of clean tech. Second, our reform of the electricity market design will incentivize the use of renewable compared to fossil fuels.
We have a lot more to contribute because we have a coastline and we have wind and we have expertise in building heavy things that can stand the pressure from wind and oceans. So we are engaging into offshore wind enthusiastically. And today, this morning, Ursula, we signed a green alliance between Norway and the European Union. We worked on that for a year. Norway has integrated our objectives to reach Paris obligations with the European Union. These are our partners. We have integrated economies.
Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back to the program. I'm being joined by Laddie Williams of our business desk. Morning, Laddie.
Good morning.
The Russian central bank is in the news. First, they sold more than 3 tons of gold in March, and now they're holding their rates steady. They're expected to hold their rates steady at 7.5%. What's behind this?
Definitely a lot going on in Russia right now, and we know they have that big deficit, you know, with their budget in 2023, and obviously they're going to have to get money, you know, from somewhere. And we know how much gold they have. They have quite a massive stash, you know, of gold there with their reserves. And now this is the first time they're publishing, you know, what they've been doing with their gold. Since the last time they gave us data about their gold was in February last year. And now we've gotten all of that data, seeing what they've been doing with it and, you know, where their reserves stand, you know, at the moment. And at the end of the day, they're trying to sell, you know, some of this gold to raise funds to, you know, cover that deficit. They have a war, you know, ongoing.
To prosecute.
Exactly. So they have to fund it somehow. We've seen, you know, oil revenue, you know, to Russia, that has, you know, gone down lower than expected, you know, at this time, even though we've seen the sanctions, you know, coming from the U.S. and their allies. So at the end of it, we're seeing this sale is a big one, but we know they bought a record amount in 2022, that's of gold, and we've seen how gold has rallied. Last year, November, gold was selling for about 1,700. That's U.S. futures. Today, we're at about $2,005. So it's a big move.
It's a big move, yeah.
At some point, it was trading at 1,600. So at the end of the day, they're seeing this rally. It's time to take some profit.
Time to take
it's good time. Even though some analysts expect gold is still going to rally even further, but it's always good to take some profit and, you know, use some of these funds to do what you have to do. But at the end of the day, they have a way of balancing their gold reserves. Make sure as long as something goes out, something has to, you know, come in. And, you know, we're seeing. But they also expected to keep rates, you know, steady. In their next meeting is rate-setting meeting. You know, everyone's looking forward to what the central bank is.
But if they keep rates steady, that means they've got a great deal of confidence in what they're currently doing, right?
So that's expectations from analysts at this point. But some are also saying they're still going to raise rates, even though last year, you know, they had to raise rates about 20%. You know, when the war started. Right. With their financial controls that they had to put in place, because we saw how, you know, the ruble weakened. We saw what they called the ruble that time. And then we saw that reversal, you know, with the capital controls they put in place. So now there's still inflationary risk at this point, because the inflation battle is still raging at this point. Even though they had to bring those rates down, it was artificially increased to about 20% last year. So they've been in the opposite direction, you know, with what other central bankers are doing. So there's still expectations that they would continue in that trajectory. But they're about 7%. So it is expected that inflation there is going to start inching up, because they have issues, you know, at this point, you know, with labor shortages. We're still seeing the ruble, you know, it's weakened about 5% since the last meeting. So they have to consider all of these things. But the experts are expecting a hold situation. But
so, I mean, it could end up being like that, or it could be a hike.
But we've seen the central bankers in Russia there. They've been hinting at, you know, raising rates going forward, tightening at this time, because they still have to make sure inflation, you know, stays in check there.
How are the markets doing, by the way?
So the markets they're quite red.
You know, we had a long holiday, although that wasn't all over the world.
It wasn't all over the world, but
I mean,
major markets were open, and we're seeing earnings. It's the earnings season, you know, right now in the global markets, even right here in Nigeria. So we're seeing markets start off in the red today in Europe. We're expecting, you know, big tech earnings, you know, coming out from the U.S., Europe, Asia. So investors already know that, you know, with the tightening cycle, we know the tech companies were heavily
affected by that.
You know, so expectations is the earnings might not be as good as we've seen from some of these banks, even though we had that banking crisis in the U.S. and most countries. So we're seeing some investors starting to, you know, take some positions out, you know, to make sure that once those results start coming
out, they don't
get hit hard by dumps.
Indeed. Thanks, Laddie. As always, Laddie and the crew will be on Business Morning right after this, and then later on BizInc with the news from across the globe. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And finally, on the program, before United Nations Security Council meeting chaired by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, as we reported at the top of the program, Elizabeth Whelan, sister of jailed American businessman Paul Whelan, had a message for the Russians. Free Paul Whelan. He was convicted in Russia of espionage in 2020 and has been designated by Washington as being wrongfully detained. Ms. Whelan was accompanied at the Security Council stakeout by U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who spoke about Mr. Whelan and Wall Street Journal reporter Ivan Geskovich.
Head into the Security Council, but it's impossible to ignore the giant elephant in the room, Russia. Russia, the convener of today's meeting, invaded its neighbors in Ukraine and struck at the heart of the UN Charter. And Russia, time and time again, has violated universal human rights and fundamental freedoms, both outside and inside its own borders. That includes arbitrarily detaining political activists, journalists, and opposition leaders, as well as the wrongful detention of American citizens.
Now Paul is being held in labor camp IK-17 in the remote province of Mordovia, held as a pawn and victim of Russia's descent into lawlessness. I no longer know what my brother looks like. The images that we see on television and in the news, that's Paul Whelan in the life he was living before he was taken captive. I am here today to tell the global community that one way to engage in effective multilateralism is to confront those countries that resort to hostage diplomacy. And I am here to tell Russia, free Paul Whelan.
Nothing can be further from the truth. It's cynical. We all know that while Russia is destroying, we are building. While they violate, we protect. The UN Charter, the UN General Assembly, the ICJ, the ICC, everywhere you look, Russia is in contempt.
There was no immediate reaction to that incident from the Russians. And that's where we wrap up our program this morning. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akiri Duluale. Have a great day ahead.